very long time since anybody's actually heard from me on these videos, but I have time now to do one. I wanted to talk about revisionist history, which is something that they talked about today on the news and so forth. And what history is sort of a complicated subject to talk about because who knows what history really is and what the truth of history is. Unless you have a time machine, you can go back in time and check it out or something. But the farther back history goes, the less we really know what the accurate story about it is. And I like to think about this as if you ever played that telephone game where we did this in school, where one kid would tell a story into the ear of the next kid, and then that kid would tell the story to the next kid, and the next kid into their ear, so they passed it along. And then after 10 kids, the last kid would tell the story again, and it would be a completely different story, absolutely different than the original story that they started out with. And that's the way history is a lot of times the more times it goes through somebody and through somebody's mouth and through time, it becomes more and more adulterated so you don't really know the actual truth of what actually happened in history. But as we come into the more modern times, this is probably something that is a major change is that they have now video cameras and they have recorded history, writing, and so forth more accurately now than ever before in history. For example, that tsunami that happened over in Indonesia, they have great pictures of that, because so many people nowadays have these cell phone pictures. Anyway, the part of the history that I'm talking about, one of the first things I want to talk about, well, before that, I want to say my own understanding of history, I think, is better than average, if I can brag. I've always done really well in history. I got straight A's. I read a lot of history. That's one of the things that I do read a lot of biographies and history. Marco Polo's biography and autobiography, and the Plutarch's lives, and I've done a lot of reading, and it does irritate me a little bit when I hear some of these revisionist histories because it has something to do with a political agenda in the current day when you revise the history. And it was Napoleon that said that history is written by the victors. But nowadays, with the internet and this type of thing I'm doing right now and all that, everybody can put together their own version of history and put it out there for people to see. And there are many losers in the battle who can tell you their history. Well, but let me give you the examples of revisionist history and see if I can parse them out for why they're doing it and what I think. And the one that comes to mind first, of course, is everybody talks about is the Holocaust, which is when the Nazi Germans during World War II systematically committed genocide against the Jewish people in Europe. And there's a lot of people in today's world who are trying to tell you that that never really happened, or it was only a really tiny little thing and all that. And the general account that has been accepted is that there were 6 million Jews systematically slaughtered like animals by the Nazis. And what proof do we have? Like I said, the telephone game goes on. If somebody says this and somebody else says that, it could be like adulterated. But ever since I can remember, when I was a young man, probably about 8 years old, I saw these movies that the Americans took when they came into Auschwitz and Dachau, and they were pictures of dead bodies of Jewish people piled up like cordwood and being plowed by bulldozers into mass graves. And it was something that I remember seeing when I was just a young man, a boy. And let me just say, I'm somebody who came about 10 years after World War II. So there wasn't such good technology back then to doctor films as there is now. You can make just any fake picture you want now with a digital, you know, computers, and those days it was really a lot more difficult, and you couldn't do quite as much with film like you can now. And those pictures were around when I was a kid, so you have my firsthand experience in that. I also have met individuals, people who, a friend of mine's mother, who had those tattoos on her arms, and she told me she was at Auschwitz, and she said, "Don't forget, it really did happen." In case anybody tries to tell you otherwise. But there are these people, they try to somehow deny that it was real. I just heard somebody recently telling me, my daughter told me that some guy said that he knew some woman and she didn't have enough numbers on her arms for her to be legitimate. So it was like people are that he claims that people are trying to fake like they had these numbers on their arms that they weren't really. And my question is, well, what Jew was she? Was she a European Jew? Was she one of the ones that Hitler just ignored? Said, "Oh, he only rounded up some of the Jews, and the rest of them faked it." See, this is the purpose behind this is, I think, pure evil in many ways. Why would you deny that? And why would you want that to be denied unless you had animosity against the Jewish people and you intended to try to do something like that again? You know? I mean, that's a disgraceful thing. I mean, those people who are the Holocaust deniers are scary because what is their agenda? Is it to try to go take another shot at it? They're claiming that the Jews are trying to gain international sympathy to be able to politically manipulate the world because because of the sympathy. But their motives, I believe, are that they're going to take another shot at killing as many Jews as they possibly can. That's what I fear. And I'm not Jewish. I don't. What is it to me? But I'm looking at it objectively. This was something that was close, though. It was not that long ago. Now, you can go back a little bit farther. Something else is I see a lot of revisionist history about is the Civil War. And this is kind of alarming. I got it from my kids coming out of school. They were taught that the cause of the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. So I hope I'm interpreting this right. They say that the cause of the Civil War was something to do with taxation on imports that the southern states had an objection to. And that existed, I think, but the only cause of the Civil War, from my interpretation of it, is the fact that they had Abraham Lincoln elected, who was an anti-Jewish party. The Republican Party at that time was an anti-Jewish, anti-slavery party, and so that's what happened. But if you want to look at it, there is records. There's the Georgia Declaration of Secession, and the prohibition of slavery is, according to them, in the territories, is the cardinal principle for for their secession in January 24th, 1861. It was voted by the majority, it was a unanimous vote in the Georgia Assembly that they said that they cannot allow a anti-slavery president to become United States president. And they had another one in South Carolina that said the same thing. Another one in Mississippi that said the same thing. They voted on the reason they stated was that they were afraid that slavery was going to be outlawed in the United States. So the only reason, I mean, that's a matter of public record. So anybody who has a question about the real cause of the Civil War, that is the real cause of the Civil War. Now, why are they denying that? Why do they try to rewrite history and make up a new history, a big stinking lie? Why are they doing that? You got to ask yourself this. And it has, I thought a lot about this. I think it has something to do with the legends of the nation. In order for them to have a moral underpinning for their political agenda that comes out of the South a lot, which has something to do with anti-government and there's a certain element of racism involved in it. They have to have a more moral legend for their background. The logos and the pathos of the thought process, so that when they create stories about their past, it has to be something that they can sell on some level. And that's what's going on right now. In order for them to give a complete version of their way that things ought to go in the history, in the future rather, such as anti-government and no taxes and no workers' rights and all that kind of stuff, they need to have the basic principle of their past has to be rewritten so that they don't have something as disgraceful as saying we were fighting for slavery in the Civil War. I mean that's what I think their political agenda is by denying this. Now the next thing I can go to is one that seems to be more perplexing to me is how they seem to be rewriting the beginning of the history of America. And a lot of the Native Americans are really pushing the idea that everything that the white man did was unjust to the Indians. And they might actually be right. That's kind of the problem. You know, what does that mean though? Because it has been that we fought the Indians and we had some sort of they were fighting us and we were fighting them, and so therefore we ended up winning. But I'm on the side, I'm reaping the benefits of the fact that the white man won that fight. So I want to say nice things if I can to revise that history, but it's hard to do. But let me just say this: what would be a nice thing? I say the Indians were not totally wiped out. They were assimilated genetically. I mean, if you go through the population of the United States, you'll find that a good number of people will have part of their heritage as and part of their genetic background as being Native Americans. So maybe that's a nice way of saying it. So they were sort of assimilated. So I don't know. The problem with revision with history is though that it's hard the farther back you go to really understand what happened. But I'm a little bit fearful of some of the stories that they're trying to write right now in regard to some of the issues I just brought up. We have to be more careful about history and what we're teaching in the schools and so forth, because it does give us the legends of our society, which we're going to base our culture upon in the future.